This story was submitted by a viewer named Sarah. I work as a night shift archivist for a historical preservation society in Savannah, Georgia. If you've ever been to Savannah, you know the city is built on its own dead, literally. The historic district sits on top of old colonial cemeteries, and at night, the heavy Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks makes the entire town look like it's draped in a shroud. The Archive building is an old three-story federal-style home built in the 1840s. My job is incredibly monotonous. I sit in the basement archive room digitizing old city blueprints, shipping manifests, and century-old photographs. Because of the delicate nature of the paper, the basement is kept at a constant, freezing 62 degrees, and the silence down there is heavy enough to press on your eardrums. I usually work completely alone from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Everything began on a Tuesday in mid-November. I was sitting at my scanning station, the only light in the room coming from the harsh glow of my dual monitors. Around 2 a.m., a brutal thunderstorm rolled in off the coast. The thunder was a low, continuous rumble that shook the foundation of the old house, and the rain was hitting the street-level cellar windows so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the glass. At 2:44 a.m., the power flickered. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed, went dark, and then the backup generator kicked in with a dull roar from the adjoining room. My monitors blinked back to life. I sighed, rubbing my eyes, and clicked back into the digitization software. I was working through a box of uncatalogued glass plate negatives from the early 1900s, mostly portraits of affluent families who had lived in the district. I loaded the next scanned image onto my screen. It was a black and white photo of a young woman standing on the front porch of a house that looked remarkably like the archive building I was currently sitting in. She was wearing a high-collared Victorian dress, looking away from the camera. But as I zoomed in to check the clarity of the scan, my mouse hand froze. In the dark reflection of the window pane right behind the woman, there was a face. It wasn't a ghostly smudge or a trick of the light. It was the distinct silhouette of a man wearing a modern, dark hooded sweatshirt. His face was entirely obscured by shadow, but his posture was unnerving. He was leaning forward against the glass, staring directly at the back of the woman's head. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning ran down my spine. A modern hoodie in a photo from 1905? A double exposure, I muttered aloud, my voice sounding thin in the empty basement. Or a hoax. Someone found this old plate and altered it before donating the box. I flagged the image as corrupted and moved on to the next negative. I placed the glass plate on the scanner bed, lowered the lid, and hit scan. The machine hummed, the bright green light passing beneath the glass. A few seconds later, the new image rendered on my monitor. My breath caught in my throat. It was the exact same porch, the exact same woman. But this time, she was looking directly at the camera, her expression twisted into a look of absolute, hysterical terror. And the window behind her was shattered. The figure in the dark hooded sweatshirt was no longer in the reflection. He was standing on the porch, his hand tightly gripping the fabric of her shoulder. I stood up so fast, my office chair rolled back and slammed into a row of metal filing cabinets. Clang! The sound echoed violently in the basement. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was impossible. Glass plate photography required a subject to sit perfectly still for seconds at a time. These looked like sequential frames from a security camera captured over 100 years ago. Suddenly, the internal intercom system on my desk buzzed. The intercom was an old analog wall unit used to communicate between the basement and the main office on the third floor. Nobody should have been up there. I walked over to the unit, my hand trembling as I hovered over the talk button. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone up there? Security?" Nothing but heavy, crackling static. And then, underneath the static, I heard a sound that made my stomach drop. It was the rhythmic, metallic click-clack of an old typewriter. We didn't use typewriters. The entire building had been modernized with digital equipment 5 years ago. The only typewriters in the building were historical artifacts locked inside glass display cases on the second-floor museum exhibit. Click-clack, click-clack, zip, the sound of a carriage return. "This isn't funny," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm calling the police!"
The moment I said the word police, the typewriter sound stopped. The intercom went completely dead, the static cutting out into an oppressive, suffocating silence. I grabbed my cell phone from the desk, intent on dialing 911, but the screen was completely blank. The battery had been at 80% just 20 minutes ago, but now it wouldn't even turn on. It was completely dead. Panic, cold and sharp, took hold of me. I decided I was leaving. I didn't care about my shift. I didn't care about the archives. I grabbed my car keys from the desk and walked toward the heavy reinforced steel door that led to the basement stairs. I grabbed the brass handle and pulled. It didn't budge. I rattled it violently, throwing my weight against the door. It was locked from the outside. The electronic keypad on the wall next to the frame was dark. The backup generator hadn't supplied power to the security locks. I was trapped in the freezing dark. I backed away from the door, my chest heaving as I tried to control my breathing. "Think, Sarah, think," I told myself. There was an old coal chute in the back storage room that led up to the street level. It had been bolted shut decades ago, but it was my only other option. I grabbed a heavy Maglite flashlight from my desk and walked into the deep archives, a maze of floor-to-ceiling metal shelving units holding thousands of historical documents. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cold air. As I made my way toward the back storage room, I heard a faint, wet sound. Drip, drip, drip. I stopped, tilting my head. I pointed my flashlight toward the ceiling, expecting to find a leaking water pipe from the storm upstairs. But the ceiling tiles were bone dry. The sound wasn't coming from above. It was coming from the narrow aisle to my left. I slowly turned the flashlight beam down the aisle. The light hit the floor, and my breath hitched. Lying in the center of the concrete floor was a trail of wet, dark leaves. They were fresh, green oak leaves, slick with rainwater mixed with thick, dark mud. The trail led from the back wall of the basement, winding through the shelves, straight toward the room I had just left. Someone had been walking through the storm, and they were down here with me. I backed up slowly, my sneakers squeaking softly against the concrete. I turned around to sprint back to my desk, but as I did, the beam of my flashlight caught something hanging from the end of one of the metal shelves. It was a piece of paper, freshly torn from an old archival ledger. It was pinned to the shelf with a rusty, hand-forged iron nail. I stepped closer, the light shaking in my hand. There was text typed onto the paper. The ink was fresh, slightly smudged, and smelling strongly of old ribbon. It read, "She looked behind her, too." A sudden, violent crash echoed from the front office area, the sound of my scanning monitor being smashed to pieces. I bolted. I ran blindly through the maze of shelves, the flashlight beam wild and erratic against the walls. I burst into the scanning room. The monitors were shattered, shards of glass littering the desk. But what caught my eye was the flatbed scanner. The lid was open. The green scanning light was moving back and forth entirely on its own, casting long, rhythmic green shadows across the basement walls. Hum, hum. I approached the desk like a person walking toward a cliff. I looked down at the glass scanner bed. There was no negative plate on the glass. Instead, lying face down on the scanner light was a human hand. It was impossibly pale, the skin wrinkled and gray as if it had been submerged in water for days. The fingernails were cracked and filled with dark river mud. And as the green light passed beneath it, the fingers slowly, deliberately flexed, gripping the edges of the glass. I let out a choked scream and fell backward, dropping my flashlight. It rolled under the desk, its beam pointing toward the dark corner of the room. In the pale, shifting green light of the scanner, I saw a figure standing in the corner. It was wearing a modern, dark, hooded sweatshirt. The hood was pulled low, completely obscuring its face in a vacuum of shadow. It was standing perfectly still, its arms hanging limply at its sides.
What do you want?" I sobbed, pressing my back against the locked steel door. "Please, what do you want?" The figure didn't speak. It didn't lunge. Instead, it slowly raised its right arm and pointed a single mud-caked finger toward the ceiling. Above me, through the thick concrete and wood of the floorboards, I heard the heavy, rhythmic click-clack of the typewriter begin again, but this time it wasn't coming from the second floor. It was directly above my head, in the first-floor lobby. Click-clack, click-clack, and then the sound of a heavy wooden door creaking open downstairs. The figure in the corner slowly lowered its hand. From beneath the dark shadow of its hood, I heard a sound that didn't belong to a monster or a demon. It was a perfectly normal, cheerful text message alert chime, the exact sound my phone makes when I receive a notification. The green light of the scanner made one final pass, and the room plunged into absolute darkness as the bulb burned out. The police found me the next morning at 7 a.m. when the day shift manager unlocked the basement door. I was sitting in the corner, clutching my knees, staring into the dark. They searched the entire building. They found no signs of forced entry, no hooded intruder, and no mud. But they did find two things they couldn't explain. On the first-floor lobby desk, sitting directly above the archive room, was an antique typewriter taken from the museum display case. Locked in the carriage was a blank sheet of modern printer paper. Typed onto the page over and over again, hundreds of times until the ink faded to a faint gray, was my exact home address. And when the technician finally managed to jumpstart my dead cell phone at the station, a single text message popped up. It had been delivered at exactly 2:44 a.m. from an unknown, unlisted number. It was a live stream video link. When I clicked it, the video showed a dark, shaky view of a bedroom. The camera was moving slowly, walking through a small, familiar apartment, passing a kitchen I recognized, before stopping at the edge of a bed. The video showed me. I was asleep in my own bed, tucked under my blue comforter. The timestamp on the video stream read November 14th, 2024, 2 years before I ever took the job at the archive. I haven't gone back to work since that night. I packed my bags, left Savannah, and moved to a small town in the Midwest, renting a third-floor apartment with 3 separate deadbolts on the door. I told myself I was safe. I told myself it was over. But last night, I woke up around 2:40 a.m. to a strange sound. It wasn't a footstep, or a broken window, or a creaking door. It was the faint, unmistakable click-clack of keys being pressed, coming from the dark, narrow space inside my bedroom closet. I am currently sitting in the kitchen with the lights on, staring at the closet door. My phone is sitting on the counter. It just buzzed with a new notification. An unknown number just sent me a single text. It's a photograph of the back of my head, taken from behind the kitchen counter where I am sitting right now. And on the screen, a new live stream link is ticking up.